draw near. You were thirsty that I might come drink, cried out in anguish that I might sing. How deep is your love? How high and how wide is your mercy? How deep is your grace? Our hearts overflow with praise to you. You knew darkness that I might know light, wept great tears that mine might be dried, stripped of glory that I might be clothed, crushed by your Father to call me your own. How deep is your love? How high and how wide is your mercy? How deep is your grace? Our hearts overflow with praise. How deep is your love? How high and how wide is your mercy? How deep is your grace? Our hearts overflow with praise to you.
So I wonder, does your heart overflow with praise to the Lord Jesus for his love and his mercy and his grace towards us? I trust that when you hear a song like that, when you hear that, the message of that text, that it would just remind us how much we have to be grateful for and all that Jesus has done for us. So I appreciate Courtney singing for us this morning. Let me ask you to open in your Bibles again here to Philippians chapter 4, where we read here just a moment ago, Philippians chapter 4. Now, I realize that many of you are much younger than I am. But if you grew up anywhere near my generation, you probably remember this old jingle. Hold the pickle, hold the lettuce. Special orders don't upset us. All we ask is that you'll let us serve it your way, right? And then it goes on to say, repeat it, have it your way, have it at Burger King. Wow, an effective commercial because you actually remember who it's for, okay? But I tracked that down on YouTube. That was a 1974 commercial. And the way it lays out is there's this dad and mom and two kids, and they go into Burger King and they make their order, and the dad just kind of says, well, could I get that Whopper maybe without lettuce and without pickle? And the lady smilingly says, sure, we can do that, sings her little ditty, and then the mom says, well, wow, if you can do that for him, can I get a little extra ketchup? And no problem, sings the second stanza, which is not quite as memorable. And then they walk away, and dad looks at his wife and his two kids and makes this observation. He says, now that's the way to do things, our way. And folks, that is the storyline of our country and of our culture, is that's the way to do things, my way, the way that I want. They say that effective marketing and advertising seeks to play upon people's natural desires while creating particular desires for their product or service. And that's exactly what those who developed that ad campaign for Burger King were trying to do. They were playing on the natural, fleshly, human desires that we want to have things our way. And then they said, so if you want to have things your way, hey, come to us. We'll give you your burger your way and your fries your way and your soda with no ice or whatever you want. We'll do it your way. But they were actually acknowledging a reality of sinful, fleshly, human nature, is that we want exactly what we want. We want to have it our way. You know, we live in a world, and sadly, we are too often part of that world that is rooted in a quest for my rights, my desires, and my way. In the text that we read a few minutes ago, Paul is appealing to us to stand fast in the Lord. That's in verse 1, and that's kind of where he's and then he's going to elaborate on, here's some things that are true of those who stand fast in the Lord. He says, you know, that means learning to get along. And he talks about Euodias and Syntyche in verses 2 and 3. And he says it means learning to live joyfully. He talks about that in verse 4. We talked about that several weeks ago before our evangelistic meetings when we were last here in Philippians 4. And now in verse 5, Paul is challenging us to learn to live outside of our own rights and our own desires. He says in verse 5, take a look at it, let your moderation be known to all men, the Lord is at hand. So that's going to be our text this morning, just that one verse. And on the surface, it may seem a bit of a puzzle. It may not seem to give us enough to really know exactly where Paul is going or what we do with that. And the essence of the verse really hinges on the meaning of the word moderation, as it's translated in the King James. Other translations may have words like reasonableness, a common one is gentleness, maybe forbearance. But whatever single term you choose to translate this one key word, it still leaves this text as a bit of a puzzle. And so we're going to try to, this morning, put the puzzle together a little bit, so to speak. And in a nutshell, what Paul is doing in this verse is confronting our natural, fleshly pursuit of my rights and my desires and my way. So with that in mind, the title of the message is My Rights, My Will, My Way, from Philippians chapter 4 and verse 5. Let's begin with prayer. Our Father, we are thankful that when Jesus came, He didn't live for His rights. He didn't live for His will. He certainly didn't live the way that He could have chosen to live had He been like us. And I pray, Father, that as we just look at this verse this morning and just kind of expand upon it a little bit, and would your Spirit just give us the mind of Christ as we examine our lives and our priorities, the things that we focus on, the things that kind of grab our thinking, the things that consume our time. And Father, I pray that we would be honest enough to recognize how much we are zoomed in on my rights and my will and my way. And I pray, Father, that by your Spirit you would minister your truth to us this morning in a manner that would change us, would cause us to consider how we really ought to live for Jesus, how we really ought to view other people, and the fact that our focus needs to be far, far less upon ourselves. Father, I do pray if there's anyone here in our auditorium, anyone listening on the live stream who has not trusted Christ as their Savior, that today would be for them the day of salvation. I pray that you would make it clear that Jesus came to die for us, and that any person who has not appropriated His saving work on the cross for themselves need but come to Him in faith and ask and receive forgiveness and the gift of eternal life. We ask for your blessing now as we spend these minutes together in your word. I pray you'd take away from us the fleeting thoughts of daily life, the distractions and pressures of whatever we may be dealing with, and allow us to just wholeheartedly give our attention to the inspired, to the divine Word of God. And I pray, Father, that you would guide my words, that what I would speak would be in keeping with your word. And I pray that your Spirit would make application in each heart and each life for your glory. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So let's look at our text again. Just this one verse, Philippians chapter 4. Let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. And as I mentioned, really, that word moderation, that's kind of the center of the verse. I mean, that's what this verse is focused on. And yet, as we read it, that maybe doesn't provide a lot of clarity for us. We may think about the word moderation as the idea of avoiding excesses, avoiding extremes, kind of being in the middle of the road, and there's a discussion to be had about, those kinds of things. But that's not really what Paul's point that he's making here in this text. And I touched on this just very briefly when we were studying verse 4 last time. And I alluded to the fact that this word can be reasonably, adequately translated a lot of different ways. Words like gentleness, like kindness, like forbearance, like yieldedness, like leniency in the context of how we view others. And my favorite, what one commentator called sweet reasonableness. Just a very gentle, kind disposition towards others. And the reason that you see all the differences in word choice is because, first of all, there's not an exact single word equivalent in English to the Greek word that's used here. And secondly, because this particular word, even in Greek, conveys a rather broad range of meaning. Certainly more than any equivalent English word would seem to convey, though we'll try to kind of home in on something that's at least reasonably close. So the Greek word that's translated moderation in our text appears in the New Testament as both an adjective sometimes, that's the top word there, epiekes, and a corresponding noun form, epieikeia. Now I give you that not because I think you need to learn these Greek words, but just because if I use moderation, I'm already kind of biasing what we're thinking. So what I'm saying is there are Greek terms here, and that's what we're trying to do is sort out in this context, in this usage, how is Paul using this particular word rather than just saying, what does moderation mean? Because that's really not the question. The question is, what does the Greek term mean? And so what I've given you here on the screen, those are just called transliterations. The Greek alphabet is different than the English alphabet. This is just using English letters to kind of let you see what it looks like, what it sounds like. Now, I have a book here. It's called A Shorter Lexicon of the Greek New Testament. There are longer lexicons of the Greek New Testament, much thicker, multi-volume books. But this book is just set up where it takes each Greek word and just gives you a simple translation. One word, two words, a couple different samples, those kinds of things. And in this shorter lexicon, for example, the translations that they suggest for these Greek words are gentleness, graciousness, clemency, tolerance, kindness, yieldedness, patience. Okay? And there's a lot more than that. But I just want us to understand that, and it is the nature of language, that words have a range of meanings. Now what a lexicon is basically a dictionary for your second language, right? It tells you, here's the Greek word, here's what it means in English. That's what a lexicon is, just a form of a dictionary. And let me just talk about where dictionaries come from and where lexicons come from, okay? Dictionaries don't come from some guy sitting down scratching his head saying, I think I'll come up with a new word and then I'll tell you what it means. What a dictionary is and what a lexicon is somebody looking at how words are being used normally in current culture. Sometimes they'll talk about ancient culture, and then in our English dictionaries, they'll say this is an archaic usage, right? Sometimes there are terms that are used in the King James Bible that dictionaries consider now archaic, like the word conversation meaning lifestyle. It's because word meanings even change in their usage. I'll give you an example, okay? How many of you who are more than 20 years old? No, some of us are more than 20. Remember from your childhood the word Google. Wasn't out there, right? And it started out, there's a history behind it, and you can look at that. But basically, we use the word Google as a verb all the time. I Googled that, right? And if you look up Google in the dictionary, it'll tell you something along these lines. It means to search the internet for something. That's what Googling is, okay? It's not because somebody even at Google sat down and said, you know what, let's call our company after this verb Google. Google, that means to search. It's just what they called their company, and now in common usage, that's how it's used. And so what lexicographers are doing, what those who write dictionaries are doing, is they are looking at words, and yes, they look at history, and they look at word formation, the letters, the combinations, the compounds. Yes, they look at those things, but principally what they do is they observe how the word is used in common speech, because that's what determines its meaning. And that's how, words can... The example I've used before, I don't remember if I've used that since I've been here. This isn't such a common thing anymore. But the word like, okay? When I grew up, like meant to show affection for. Like meant to appreciate something, right? And then a while back, like came to be a word of speech. And I'm like, he's over here. And she's like, whatever. And when I grew up, the word go meant, you move in a direction. And then it became a word of speech. He goes, and she goes, and I go, whatever. And you know what? I used to tell kids when I was a teacher years gone by, that's not the proper dictionary. And you know what? They showed me if you go to an online dictionary, it is proper usage. Maybe not proper, it's colloquial or slang or whatever. But dictionaries, lexicons, are about how words are used. And so what we want to do this morning is take a look at this Greek word here. And you know what? Between the two, the adjective and the noun form, the same root, they appear a grand total of 7 times in the New Testament. Just 7. Now, I realize that, if it was 23, this would be a little harder. If it was 176, it would be really, really hard. But 7 times, we can look at all of them. We've already looked at one of them. And we can just try to look at, in the context, what does the way that this word gets used suggest to us about what it means? And we call this doing a word study, per se. This is, some of the part and parcel of what lexicographers do. They examine across a broad range of writings. Lexicographers will study how Greek words are used in the ancient cultural Greek, too. In the common Greek and classical Greek. But when we have biblical terms, the best place to start is how they're used in the Bible, where those words are selected, by the mind of God, if you will, as He gave inspiration to the writing of these words. So we're going to just quickly go through the other 6 appearances of this word. The first of them is found in Acts 24 and verse 4. And this is where there's a guy named Tertullus, and he's kind of a spokesman for the Jews, and he's appearing before the governor, the new governor, Felix, and he's making some allegations against Paul. And he says, notwithstanding that I be not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. Now, clemency, not the word I would have chosen to translate this, right? That's one of those maybe a little bit archaic in its usage. But it has that idea, that you would patiently hear, that you would kindly listen to what I'm trying not to wear you out, Tertullus says, but I really would like you to hear this, so I'm going to impose on your, grace to listen to what I have to say. Next appearance, 2 Corinthians 10:1. Paul says, now I, Paul, myself, beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. So in each of these passages, the underlined word, that's the Greek word epiekes or epieikeia. By the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you. So they're set a little bit in contradiction to boldness. He's saying, I come to you in the meekness, in the patience, in the gentleness of the way Jesus would come to you. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 3. This is one of those qualifications of pastors, of bishops. And it says, not given to wine, no striker, that's somebody who's contentious and quarrelsome, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, there's our word, not a brawler, not covetous. And in Titus chapter 3 and verse 2, you see the contradictions though there, right? It's in contradiction to a striker, somebody who's greedy, somebody who's a brawler, somebody who's covetous. So sometimes we get a sense of a meaning with what a word is contrasted to. In Titus chapter 3 and verse 2, Paul instructs Titus to exhort people that they speak evil of no man, to be no brawlers. Same word that we saw in 1 Timothy 3, showing all meekness. That's the same word we saw used to describe Jesus in 2 Corinthians 10, unto all men. And I'll come back and summarize these a little bit more as we finish. Let me just go through the last two. James 3:17. It says, but the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, that's our term, and easy to be entreated. That's someone who's approachable and compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. So there's a bunch of, they're not synonyms, but they're words that kind of go together, ideas and character qualities that go together. And then 1 Peter 2:18. Here Peter says, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle is the word, but also to the froward. The Greek word is scolios. We get our word scoliosis from it. Means literally crooked or bent. And so here we see that gentleness in contrast to that which is a bit twisted, a bit crooked, a bit bent. And so on the surface, if we just went through those 6 verses plus our text, we would find that the King James translators chose the word gentle 4 times, and that's the common choice of many translators. They chose the word patient once. They chose the word clemency once. They chose the word moderation once. And they were just selecting from different words that kind of overlap somewhat with that Greek term. And it's a word that is presented as a contrast to someone who is bold or brash. It's a contrast to someone who is a striker, someone who's contentious, someone who's quarrelsome. Twice it's said in contrast to someone who is a brawler. By the way, the Greek word, coincidentally enough, for brawler is machos, right? So here it actually says someone who is gentle like this is amachos. They're without this kind of contentious spirit. And it also adds and puts in at odds with those who are froward. Autocorrect keeps wanting my script here to say forward, but it's froward, right? That which is twisted. So what we see is that this moderation that Paul calls for is the exact opposite of a spirit of contentiousness and self-seeking. And it's a form of gentleness or meekness, but not to be confused with being a wimp. It's not a Casper Milquetoast kind of a thing. The idea is a kind of purposeful, self-effacing kindness, where life is not all about me, where I'm much more concerned for the sake of others. I'm not looking to draw attention to me. I'm not looking to battle for me and my things and my stuff. Last time I mentioned that a lack of this quality stood in the way of joy, and I described what Paul is speaking against as selfish rigidity. So, the idea of this someone who is epiekes is not just selfishly oriented. They're not just rigid, and I got to have my way. I want to do my things. I want my rights. I want my will. I want my way, right? This stands very much at odds with that. And I suggested to us last time that if I were trying to translate this with a single word, the word that I would choose would be graciousness. Not in the sense of God's grace, but in the idea of just those things that we've seen as we work this through. Someone who's kind, who's approachable, who's open, who's gentle, who's self-effacing, not making themselves a big deal, who's just a winsome person that you feel like you can communicate with. And it's that kind of an idea of graciousness, and I might even suggest a humble graciousness. A person who is all the things we've alluded to so far: patient, understanding, considerate, generous, magnanimous, you could say, easily entreated, someone who is big-hearted, someone who indulges not their own shortcomings, but who is lenient and gladly indulges the failures and shortcomings of others. Just giving people a little bit of space, some long suffering. So that's really kind of the essence of this word. And that very much informs our understanding of this passage. And the reason we spent the time kind of doing that word study is because certain verses are so centered on the meaning of a word. And this is one of those kind of verses. So I could tell you what the commentators say, and they say pretty much what I just said, okay? But, I just wanted us to try to come to a conclusion somewhat from how the word is used in the Scripture, which is where the lexicographers and the commentators draw their conclusions. So we're trying to draw our conclusions from the Bible, not so much from external sources, even good external sources, but we want to look to the Bible. So let me just kind of from a practical standpoint make some suggestions to us this morning. To be humbly gracious, right? To manifest this quality that Paul says it should appear to all men. This is something that should be true about you. You need to learn to stop demanding your rights. In other words, learn to accept less than you think you're due. Our American culture is all about rights. There aren't a lot of countries that have, as part of their founding documents, a Bill of Rights. I mean, that's one of the things that we value about our country. That's one of the things that reflects the wisdom of our founding fathers, that they recognized that in the context of governance, the government needs to be careful not to intrude on people, and ergo, people have certain rights that are trying to be laid out lest the government trample upon them. And throughout our nation's history, we've had lots of debates and discussions and division within our country as how much should the government do? How much should it not? We're currently enmeshed in one of those debates about the whole thing with COVID. Debates about where can the government go? What can the government do? And that's the question we're going to talk about this legislation. How far can the government control how people think, what they do, legislate, mandate things? Those are difficult questions. But because we live in that kind of a culture, that cultural thinking, that American thinking that we value and that we tend to uphold, it influences us as individuals in what is typically not a healthy way. It is not a biblically healthy thing to be contentious about my rights. Now, it's easy to rationalize, right? They are my rights. I'm just standing up for them. But that just leads to sometimes a whole line of thinking that just becomes all about me. You can't do that to me. You can't say that to me. You can't hurt me. You can't harm me. That's my right. You can't take that away from me. And it becomes a very self-oriented way of thinking. And I say there's a fine balance here, and this is why I kind of decided that next Sunday night we'll talk about this more, is because I'm not saying that there's not a place. I mean, I believe in the rights that we have in the First Amendment to the free exercise of religion. And I'm not saying there's not a place sometimes to battle for those things in the context of a broader good. But here Paul is talking about, you as an individual, you need to let go of your rights. And being so focused on what's mine, you can't take it from me. That was not the way that Jesus lived. Let me have you turn to Philippians 2. And really, this is a theme that we looked at some length earlier, but really it's introduced to us again in this verse. In Philippians 2, starting in verse 3, let me read there. And Paul says, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory." That's just that contentious idea of advancing me. "But in lowliness of mind, in humility, let each esteem other not equal to yourself, better than yourselves. Look not every man on his own things," which is where we naturally look, "but every man also on the things of others." And then he says, here's the standard. Verse 5, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." And then it describes for us someone who, if anyone has a right, it's Jesus. Who being in the form of God, in other words, he was God. He came, he took upon him human flesh. Thought it not robbery to be equal with God. Jesus wouldn't be dishonest to say, "I am God." And in fact, he said as much. And people didn't like it. But that is who he was. That is who he is. But by his own choosing, he made himself of no reputation. And he took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And his trial was such a ridiculous mockery that in our country it would have been thrown out of court. But Jesus did not demand his rights. He didn't exercise his rights. 1 Peter 2:23 says about Jesus, who when he was reviled, when he was railed upon, when he was abused, he reviled not again. And the word actually has a prefix anti. He didn't revile back. He didn't come back in kind. He accepted being reviled without answer, without defense, without demand, without, using the power and authority that he could have called upon, to defend himself, to stand for himself. When he suffered, he threatened not. No retribution. In fact, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. But committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. And I want to illustrate the points that I'm making here this morning using our present COVID culture just a little bit. Okay, now, I'm going to head into some dangerous territory here. Mask wearing. Okay? Who'd ever thought that wearing a mask would be a volatile subject? But, in our day, it seems that it is. And everybody has opinions. Now, I often say to people wherever they land on this issue, it's pretty safe to say that nobody enjoys wearing a mask. Anybody here enjoy wearing a mask? Okay, even if you believe wholeheartedly in it, most of us don't. Well, Jason, other than Jason, right? Most of us don't enjoy wearing a mask. We wear it for other reasons. But whether we enjoy it or not, we are strong in our conclusions about it. And let me just kind of stereotype two ways of thinking about it. Some months back, I had been up at Camp Joy, about a 2-hour drive away, and I was there for a board meeting, and I was driving back. It was, after dark, and, as my wife and kids would tell you, that I could never be a long-haul trucker. People say, don't ever say never. Listen, I wouldn't live. Put me in a vehicle and I get sleepy, okay? So I couldn't do it. I could try, but it would be an unsuccessful pursuit. Either that or I would go broke because I'd have to drive for 45 minutes and stop and take a nap and drive for 45 minutes and stop and take a nap, and I'd never get there and it just wouldn't work. So I could never be a long-haul trucker. And so this 2-hour drive back from Camp Joy was more than I could endure without a break. So I pulled into this speedway and just sat there in the parking spot and took a nap for a while. And then I woke up and I went into the speedway to pick up a Diet Mountain Dew, okay? Try and put a little caffeine in my system so I could make the remaining 45, 50-minute drive home without falling asleep, and I forgot to put my mask on. Now, you would think, this was in Illinois, okay, not Wisconsin. I think it would have been different in Wisconsin. But in Illinois, you would think that I walked in there with a gun out. There was like 5 people simultaneously in chorus accosted me, put your mask on. It's like, whoa, sorry, I forgot. I slipped out, went and got my mask from my car, came back in, and they were still looking at me strange. It's like, who is this guy? And let me tell you, that is not epi case, right? A gracious leniency towards others. They were not very gracious. They were not very lenient towards me in that instance. Now, let's go to the other side, and that's the person who refuses to wear a mask. And if that's you, you're probably of the thinking that they don't help. And there are lots of strong opinions on that. But let me make this suggestion. Let's say that your child is going in for surgery, and the surgeon has a bad cold. And the surgeon says, you know what? I don't believe in masks. I don't believe in scrubs. I don't need to wash my hands. It doesn't matter any, I'm just going to step in and do this surgery. Now, whatever your opinion is on masks in the COVID context, my guess is you would think, surgeon, couldn't you just give my child the benefit of the doubt on this? Couldn't you just kind of maybe wear your scrubs, wash your hands, do your thing that people tend to think help, maybe, for the sake of my child. And doing so is a mark of the graciousness that says, even if I maybe don't think this is necessary, even if I maybe don't think that this is valuable, for the sake of other people, I'm going to graciously yield to it. Now, most of us are probably somewhere in between that spectrum, somewhere along in there. None of us like masks. We probably wear them some when we wish we didn't have to. Whatever your thoughts may be. But I just use that as an illustration because we all know those feelings, right? We all know the ire, and it's rooted and tied into what I think is right. Whether I think they help or whether I think they don't, what I think is appropriate, the degree to which I think the government should have control. And again, I'm not saying that those points aren't worthy of discussion. I'm just saying that our natural penchant is to assume that my conclusions, my way, my rights ought to carry the day. And anybody who differs or transgresses on my rights, I'm not going to like that. And I'm going to defend my position and explain myself and whatever. And I just want to suggest that, what Paul is after here is a gracious spirit that is willing to let go of some things. Even a well-intentioned patriotic resolve, over government matters, even a well-intentioned concern for the health, whatever it might be, whatever your perspective might be, we can allow a little grace for other people. Because see, our nature is to feel fully justified in my position, whatever it may be. Correct in terms of my rights. And yet, generally, though we like to fashion our arguments from a more altruistic kind of a philosophical standpoint, often they are born out of self-interest, self-righteousness, self-sufficiency, self-love, and a whole host of other self kind of things. To be humbly gracious, you must learn to stop focusing on your rights and look instead to the good of others. Second point, stop promoting your will. Now, I suppose in a sense this isn't much different from pursuing our rights, but I just want to encourage you to think about the things that you desire, the things that we pursue. What we do and why we do it and how we live our lives. What is the real motivation behind what you do? And the sad fact is this, folks, that even our highest and best motives are so easily corroded by self-interest that we tend to give ourselves a pass and overlook just how domineering we are. We excuse how much we look out for ourselves. And we have a vision, we have a will, we have a desire, and we have convinced ourselves that is absolutely to the nth degree right, and therefore I'm entitled to it. And nothing should be able to change that or adjust that. And I understand that we would piously reserve to God the freedom to do that, but we're not too eager to have him do so. We're kind of quick to be set in our ways and be a little bit like Abraham, when God said, you're going to have a son. He says, I've already got Ishmael. I've got this all figured out, God. We helped you out. We brought this about. Now, God, just make sure that Ishmael lives before you. And that's how we think. Even when we have good aspirations. Even if there are things that may be an appropriately noble pursuit, yet we're thinking about it in the context of how I'm going to do this. And we want to bind everybody else to have to comply with how I am going to look at it. And I confront you with this, and if you find yourself justifying and rationalizing and saying, no, Pastor, that's not true for me. I'm the one exception here in this auditorium where that's not true for me. Let me suggest you're probably not the one exception. And that's not because there are more exceptions. Okay? It's because this is the way the flesh works. We're consumed with our own rights and with our own will. And Paul is cutting to the heart of that. We tend to justify the way we are, right? Ever hear anybody say, or maybe you've said, I'm not going to cater to so-and-so's immaturity. Well, what are you saying? Is, I'm better. Okay? He's immature, she's immature. And you know what? I don't have to adjust what I do because they got a problem. And folks, that's how we think. Rather than saying, this whole idea of this kind of graciousness is, you know what? I'm going to put myself out for the sake of helping somebody else. Yeah, maybe they're immature. Maybe they're off the mark. Maybe they could use a little bit of adjustment. Maybe I can help them with that, but I'm not going to demand. And I'm not going to enforce. And I'm not going to just try to impose. I'm just going to graciously give them leniency. Give them a little bit of space. You know, and I do understand that there are certain things, you know, if somebody tells me that they don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you know, I'm probably going to not just let that sit there, okay? You know, but I'm still going to do that with a grace and a patience that they don't understand. And the sad truth is what they need is Christ. And so rather than alienating them, rather than pounding them, rather than pointing out how horribly off they are, and here's my 126 reasons, and I've got them all, you know, I'm going to try to gently, graciously help them come to see who Jesus really is and what Jesus has done for them. And it's that spirit of grace oftentimes that opens the door to even have that conversation. And to have that conversation be heard and listened to and considered. You know, when Jesus lived on this earth, he lived for the sake of others. He lived to do the will of his Father. And he died in keeping with the will of his Father and at the hands of sinful men. Remember Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Luke 22, verse 41 says that Jesus knelt down and prayed. And in verse 42 it says, here's what he said, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. Now, the point of that verse, you know, and sometimes we puzzle over that because we know that Jesus was, and I don't mean to trivialize anything, but he was all in on the, you know, the eternal plan of the Godhead. But when Jesus took upon him human flesh and lived upon this earth, so that he can be our representative, so that he can be our substitute, he lived with, you know, he was without sin, but he lived with the natural inclinations, the you know, and concerns and things that come to the human nature, and the prospect of what was before him, both in the physical realm and in the spiritual realm, bearing sin. He who had never sinned, carrying that sin, experiencing the wrath of God, separation from his Father he had never experienced before. Those were burdensome things. And he expressed his burden by saying, Father, if there was another way, I wish there was. But nevertheless, this is the way. And this is your will. Ergo, it's not my will. And I will do it. And that's the kind of spirit we need to have. Stop promoting your own will. And embrace the will of the Father. If you want to be like Jesus, if your moderation is to be known among all men, then you need to stop demanding your rights and promoting your will. Let Jesus have the preeminence. Then thirdly, to be graciously humble, you must learn to stop wanting your way. Okay? And again, these are subtle distinctions, but you know, this has to do with our desires. And this is the hook that Burger King was after. You know, the essence of our flesh is to want what we want. To want things our way. If they're going our way, we want to keep them going that way. If things aren't going the way we want, then our minds tend to gravitate to, let's make this change. Or maybe we get envious of somebody who things seem to be going the way that we wish they were going for us. And we just, you know, go through all these wrong patterns of thinking because we want our way. We want what we want. So let me give you another COVID illustration. Maybe you've thought about this, maybe you haven't. But this last week, the president signed, and I think I've got the numbers right. Something may have changed in the 11th hour that I'm not familiar with, but a $1.9 trillion so-called COVID relief bill. And again, most of us have different opinions about different provisions of that bill. But included in it are direct stimulus payments of $1,400 per person, including dependents. Now, even on that provision, people have different views. You know, and I'll tell you that personally, I'm reserved a little bit about deficit spending and about populist programs that just put money in people's pockets. You know, but you know, I mean, that's our government makes decisions. But you know, but you know what? I'm not of the mind that when that, let's see, my wife and me, my daughter, $4,200. When that $4,200 appears in my checking account, probably this week, I probably won't send it back. I don't know what your plans are, you know, but you know, because even if in principle, even if philosophically I maybe think, I'm not sure this is the wisest course, but you know what? I'll take what's coming to me. And that's a reflection on our mindset. And I'll tell you another thought that I had this week, okay? This is where I become my own sermon illustration, okay? I was sitting there and I was thinking, what if they had done this back when I had 6 kids at home? 6 plus 2, that's 8. 8 times 1,400. Man, that would be $11,200 I'd be getting this week rather than a measly $4,200. Where was this when I had kids in the home, right? And I overplay that a little bit, but the fact is, I did have the thought. But, had this been around a while back, I would have come out much better. Because we want what we want. And tell yourself all you want that you're principled and you're philosophical and you're not selfishly oriented in your thinking. I can come up with more examples that one of them, sooner or later, you're going to say, okay, you got me there. I do think like that sometimes. Right? Because we are people who want what we want. And we can easily rationalize what we want. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to appreciate, what I always tell people is this. If you're an honest, tax-paying member of our government, and the government, whether foolish or not, decides they want to give you money, you know what? You have paid in, take it, okay? You may disagree with that. You may send yours back, okay? But, my maybe this is a rationalization, is that I pay my taxes, the government makes decisions, they do what they do, I'll accept what they do, as long as it doesn't make me sin. I'll accept what they do. But there is we tend to frame things in view of our own self-interest. And we tend to be okay with things that we like and passionately, philosophically opposed to things that we don't. And hey, be philosophically opposed, that's fine. But just don't tell yourself that you are above the fray, that you are not influenced by the fleshly thinking that demands our rights, that pursues our own will, that wants our own way. Let me have you look again at our text, and as you're finding your place here, we're in Philippians 4, verse 5. Let me ask you a question. What do you want to be known for? Your extraordinary good looks? I don't have that problem, okay? Do you want to be known for your quick wit, for your sense of humor, for your wisdom, for your wealth, for your accomplishments, for your profession? As preachers, we often want to be known for our preaching. And Paul has an answer for us as what we ought to want to be known for. He says, let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. Now again, this is one of those things that's a little bit of a puzzle, because admittedly it may sound a little bit like someone saying, make sure everyone knows you're humble, right? There's some there doesn't kind of, let your graciousness be known. Paul isn't saying just go out there and advertise, look at what a gracious, humble, kind-hearted person I am. That's not what he's saying. But the point is this, and I've tried to make the point that, our culture is in a very different place, and in fact, ourselves in our own flesh, we're in a very different place. And when a person allows the Spirit of God to so change you that you are characteristically that humbly gracious person, it will be known by all men. People will notice the difference because it is in such rare supply. And Paul is saying, this ought to so characterize how you live, how you think, what you do, that people can't help but notice. That's different. This person doesn't stand up and demand their rights. This person isn't always just trying to advance their will. This person isn't just concerned for what's mine and my way and my things and there's clearly this outward look that is, in some approximation, like Jesus. And people will take note of that. That's Paul's point. Rather than focusing on my rights, my will, and my way, I need to be focused on my Savior. And in a nutshell, someone who is humbly gracious is burdened to live for Jesus, pointing people to Him and wholly depending on Him. Our text says, let your moderation be known unto all men. The Lord is at hand. We might translate that, the Lord is near. Now there can be a couple, I could come up with more, but 2 key possibilities here. That could be nearness in time, or that could be nearness in space or presence or something like that. So it could be saying, the Lord's return is near. So in other words, that would be motivation. You know, the Lord's going to come back. What do you want him to find you doing? How do you want him to find you thinking, you know, when he returns? You know, don't you want to be a person whose moderation is known to all men? And you can't just do that the moment you see him in the air. It's too late then, okay? So one way of thinking is that, you know, it's talking about as a matter of an inspiration, as a matter of a motivation, that Jesus is coming back soon, and we want to be living for him as he returns. The other mindset would be that the Lord is near to us. You know, the idea of Galatians 2:20, you know, Christ lives in me. You know, where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst. The idea that Jesus never leaves us or forsakes us. The fact that he is always watching us, praying for us. He's at work to change me and to make me more like him. He's near me personally, and we need to allow him to work in us for his glory. And you say, which is it? I would favor number 2. Some people would say, well, it's both, and that's a legitimate way of thinking about it. But the point is, we should be mindful that, you know, our life is supposed to be centered on Jesus. We're supposed to be living for him, you know, and we're living in light of his soon return. And we're living in light of the reality of his presence within us and amidst us. All of those things are true. And he is to be the focus of how we think and how we live. He's to be our example. He's to be our pattern and our model. So we need to live for Jesus, pointing people to him and wholly depending on him. And folks, you know, this is a very, very essential, needful thing in our lives. It's, you know, don't justify to yourself, you know what, I am who I am, and I'm going to be who I, you know. A lot of times people excuse as a matter of personality the way that they come across to people. Now, I get that personality is deep-rooted, and there are certain things about just our temperament that are somewhat a function of the way the Lord made us, but the point is this, you know. If the Lord made you greedy, I mean, if you are naturally greedy and stingy, you want to leave that baggage on the Lord, or you want to say, you know what, I may feel that way, but God can help me move past that. You know, and if I'm naturally edgy and kind of condescending and kind of domineering, do you really want to defend that as that's how God made you? Or do you want to understand that God can give you victory in those areas? And so in one sense, this may seem a little bit like how we come across, but it's really rooted in, am I cultivating in my heart the thinking of Jesus, the outlook of Jesus, the priorities of Jesus, the graciousness towards others of Jesus? And God absolutely will help us to that end. But, you know, it's important for us because we need to be more like Jesus. You know, let me have you turn to Galatians chapter 5, verse 22. Familiar passage on the fruit of the Spirit. And really, Christ-likeness, the cultivating of the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, Christian growth, those are all different ways of talking about the same need, the same concept, the same reality. In Galatians 5:22 says, the fruit of the Spirit is, and many of us have memorized these, you know, and there's subtle differences in some of the words, so some synonyms, but it says love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. And one commentator suggested that here in Philippians chapter 4, this is just really kind of an implicit teaching about the fruit of the Spirit. You know, there's the account about Euodias and Syntyche, and that's talking about our need to love each other and to have peaceable relations with one another, and to be temperate, self-controlled, not lashing out, not struggling in that regard. And then they have suggested, you know, there is the idea of joy, right? Love, joy, verse 4, right? Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. And then we come to verse 5. Let your moderation be known to all men. Let that graciousness. And really, if you look at the fruit of the Spirit, you've got long-suffering. You've got gentleness. You've got goodness. You've got meekness. And if you roll all 4 of those together, you get what Paul's talking about in verse 5. You know, maybe more than that even. But there really is here an appropriate desire to allow God to change us, to be more like Jesus, to cultivate in our spirit towards others long-suffering and gentleness and goodness and kindness and meekness, all of those kinds of things. You know, we need this to be true of us so that we are more like Jesus. We need it to experience God's joy and peace. Last week, the reason I mentioned verse 5 was I said there are certain obstacles to living a joyful Christian life. And one of them is just kind of this selfish rigidity where I've got to have my way. Well, guess what? If you've got to have your way, you don't always get it. And if that's what determines your joy, you're just going to be a grumpy person because you're going to find out that in this life there are obstacles to my rights and obstacles to my will and obstacles to my way. And if I dig my heels in and say, I got to have my rights, my will, and my way, then I'm going to be frustrated with whatever comes along in life because so many things run contradictory to that. But if I want to have a life of joy, I've got to let go of demanding my rights. I've got to let go of wanting my way. I've got to let go of pursuing my will, my desires, my priorities, and instead look to Jesus and let him change me to be more like him. We need this kind of gracious spirit in order to get along with others. That is, verses 2 and 3, and these two women who were contending, and perhaps they both were convinced of their rights. That they were in the right. Clearly, these were not, wicked women in the characteristic sense. These were ladies who had a desire to serve God, but they were struggling with each other because apparently they saw things a little bit differently. And a little bit of humble graciousness probably would have gone a long way in helping them. And it'll go a long way in our relationships one with another if we'll let go of my rights, my will, my way, and look instead to Christ first and then to one another and to the needs and burdens of those around me. And we need to develop this kind of spirit, this kind of attitude in order to point the lost to Jesus. And I mentioned that idea that, let this be seen by everyone else. And what that does is that opens that opportunity. If we think and live and act and talk like the world, what do we have to offer the world in terms of what it means to come to Christ? What are we saying? Look at how Jesus has changed me. I'm just like you. Well, that's not very appealing. That's not very inviting. But when that coworker says, he never seems to get upset about this stuff. He seems to have patience for the boss and for coworkers, and when somebody creates more work for him, he doesn't get all upset. He just kind of handles that with grace and with patience. And then you come to that person and you say, hey, I don't know if you have a church home or not, but I'd love to have you come to church with me on Easter Sunday. Would you do that? They might say, yeah, maybe so. Maybe I will. But what's the appeal if we're just like the world around us? We need to manifest that adjustment in how we come across to people, to be like Christ and to open doors of opportunities for him. And this is not easy to do. You can't just sit down today, bow your head, pray, and say, Lord, change my personality. Poof, okay? If it were that easy, everybody would do it, right? Okay? Now, I'm all for bowing your head and saying, Lord, I see some need for change in my life. And I need your help desperately. But it's a process then of yielding to what God will do step by step, day by day, from glory to glory, as Paul talks about in Corinthians, where we are changed into the image of Christ. And it does start with recognizing the need and have a burden to see that change come about. And then, ups and downs, some failures, some defeats, some victories, hopefully, and strides forward. But where God begins that process then of change as we acknowledge the need and as we aspire to allow him to do what he wants to do. So to be humbly gracious, folks, we need to stop demanding our rights. We need to stop promoting our wills. We need to stop wanting our ways and just live for Jesus in dependence on him. During one of the quarterfinal matches at Wimbledon in 1973, a guy named Roger Taylor was playing, and I'd never heard of Taylor until I stumbled onto this, okay? But he was playing the other guy's name I recognized, 17-year-old Bjorn Borg. And in this match, Taylor was serving. Lou, you probably knew him, but I'm not a tennis aficionado. But Taylor was serving match point. And the umpire called Taylor's serve in and declared him the winner of the match. And Borg, who is no John McEnroe, okay? He didn't throw rackets or curse out the umpire or whatever. But Borg expressed his dissatisfaction with the call. That he was convinced that ball was out. And the umpire had already declared Taylor the winner. And Taylor went to the umpire and said, you know what? Let's play it over. Let's play it over. How often does that happen? I grew up in the John McEnroe era. It never happened with him, okay, ever. And if you don't know who it is, go watch some videos if you just want to have your blood boil, okay? It's somebody who is so disrespectful and so upset. But in any event, good tennis player, but, not a happy, pleasant guy. The opposite of what, Paul is talking about here. But the word out is that Taylor endeared himself to millions of people who were watching or who subsequently watched that match because his spirit and his attitude was so uncharacteristic, so different from what they were used to seeing. Now, I couldn't locate enough details about Taylor to know if he was a Christian or not. I'm not suggesting that he necessarily was. I'm just saying that the right kind of spirit makes an impact. And Jesus wants you and me to have the right kind of Christ-like Christian spirit, and it will make an impact. People will notice.